Let's get started on a new doll. I'm making her for a customization contest called Blythe vs. Blythe. The theme is back to school, but we're celebrating dolls of color. So I decided I wanted to do Hermione going back to Hogwarts. But wait a minute, didn't I just say dolls of color? Hermione isn't black. The books describe Hermione as having frizzy, untamable dark hair, brown eyes, and protruding teeth. And even though I don't agree with a lot of what Rowling says, she even agrees that Hermione can be black. Even the adult Hermione on Broadway was portrayed by a black woman. So let's get started. On the back of Blythe heads are 3 screws. Once you've undone those, you need to push on the doll's ear to get it to open up. Then you unscrew the scalp to remove it, then remove the T-bar in order to pop the eye mechanism out. Then we're ready to get started. The first thing that needs to be done is to sand off all the gloss and makeup. Acetone melts this plastic, so sanding is really the best way. The really intimidating part of these dark pigmented dolls is that they show every scratch. You can buff them out later, but it's going to take a lot of work. Now that the sanding is done, it's time to start working on the mouth. My goal for her is to have a nice, beautiful, open smile. So I use my Dremel to open up a hole in the mouth and do some basic shaping. Then I use my chisels to start getting some more finer details. Don't worry about any scratches, we'll buff them out later. I have this great sanding tool that helps me get the really fine details. Then I work on opening the mouth even wider. I don't want to do too much work on her until I'm able to get the epoxy down. But this is a good start. Now let's get started with the epoxy. I've never sculpted eyes before, so I decided to use these plastic spheres in order to keep the epoxy in place. So then I pulled out my A's 2-part epoxy and measured equal parts of A and B. I mixed it together for 2 minutes and then let it sit for 5 minutes, then applied it to my doll. Since I've never sculpted eyes before, I have no clue what I'm doing, which can be both fun and a little terrifying. I knew I was going to have to build out the forehead a little bit and build some sort of eyelid, so I just played with it until I thought it looked good. One of the tough things about Aves epoxy is that it has a short working time, but luckily after it's cured you can still carve and sand it, so it'll get smooth in the end. Now the really difficult thing, getting the other eye to match. I know people aren't often symmetrical, but dang, I want a doll to be. It's okay, I'll carve more of it later. I let the epoxy harden for 24 hours. Then I mixed up some more Aves and then got to placing. The way I seem to sculpt is I start with the bigger shapes and then slowly refine into the shapes I want. Once I have a rough nose shape crafted, I go in and I start refining the smaller details. Sometimes you just have to add more epoxy. Once I'm finished with the medium level details, I go in and start putting the finer details. The really delicate details will come with carving and sanding later. Once you're done shaping, it's always nice to go in with a little bit of water and smooth out the epoxy. After the nose is cured, we sand. I always start out with some larger grit sandpaper so I don't have to do quite as much work. I decided to take out the plastic spheres to see how the eyes held up. So far, so good. Then I started carving the lips. And a little bit around the chin. Then I started sanding to smooth out her forehead. Then I did some detail work around the nose and the lips. I don't want her upper lip to be too thick because I want her to have a big smile on her face. And this is the point where I apparently lose my mind. Yep, after all that work, I decided to cover it all with epoxy. I decided she needed smile lines, so epoxy went on. After that cured, it was time to start sanding. I wanted to even the texture on Hermione's forehead, so I used a sanding block to even it up. Then I used some wood carving chisels and some sanding tools to start refining some details. However, when I went in with my Dremel into the back to make some room for teeth, I slipped and ruined her mouth. So I had no choice but to start putting epoxy back on. Then I let that cure for 24 hours. Then I started the detailing process all over again and carved some nostrils. Then I started to buff out all the scratches with different levels of sandpaper. I start with about 220 grit and then go all the way up to 1500. Now to paint her brown again. I first need to mix the colors to match her skin tone. I'm going to use her backplate as a place to test colors, so I need to prep it by doing all the things I did with the faceplate. So I start by sanding off the gloss with a 220 grit sanding sponge, and continue sanding by using finer and finer grit sanding sponges. Then I get out my safety equipment and my Mr. Super Clear and I get to spraying. Then I start mixing colors. I don't have any great advice for this, except for just to get some paint and start mixing things and see if you can match colors. Once I have the matching color, I'm ready to start spraying the faceplate. I used a few coats of Mr. Super Clear before I started painting. Then I used my airbrush to spray on the paint. I did about 3 coats, then finished it with another coat of Mr. Super Clear. Next, we need to work on her face up. My first step is to get out my artist pastels. These are a great way to get some color on the face so it blends more naturally. You simply use an X-Acto blade or some sandpaper to get a fine dust. You can mix that dust together to get the color that you want. Then use paint brushes to apply it to the face just as if it was makeup. I usually start with contouring and slowly build up the color. Then add some additional colors like blush. I laid down a color where I want the eyebrows to go, but I'm not going to paint the eyebrows right away. Be sure to spray Mr. Super Clear in between coats just to help you build up the color. You can even add some highlights if you wish. And maybe a few other details. Now to paint some freckles and some eyebrows. All of the painting I'm going to do is going to be with watered down acrylics. Since she's a preteen, I thought some freckles would be in order. Next is eyebrows. Now I usually use watercolor pencils for my eyebrows, but this time I decided to try to use paint. I started by layering lighter shades of dark brown and eventually getting to almost black. Then it was time to mix up colors for the lips and nostrils. I struggled with the lips a little bit because I didn't want them to be pinky. I want them to be kind of a pink brown. Then I lined the upper eyelid. She's looking so cute. Let's make her some teeth. I sculpt teeth out of a translucent polymer clay. First, you knead it together to make it soft. Then I pinch off little pieces so I can ensure that all the teeth are the same size. Then I pinch it with my fingers to give it a shape I like. Add a bit of texturing, and then do some cleanup with my clay tools. Then gently scoop them up and put them in the oven at 260 degrees for 5 minutes. Once they're cool, I apply a gloss varnish. While those dry, I apply a satin varnish to the lips. Then I get out my handy-dandy E6000 glue and glue in the teeth. While those dry, I add semi-gloss to the inner corners of the eye. The teeth really help finish up that smile. Let's make and replace her eyes. So I first need to remove her eye chips. So I do that by heating up the end of a glue stick and attaching it to the eye. After that cools, they pop right out. Now it's time to paint some pupils. So I get out my black paint and my glass blanks. I have this wonderful little tool to paint the pupils. It helps you paint the pupil in the center every time, not to mention an even circle. I don't know if it's lawful to be in love with paint, but folks, I am in love with this paint. All of the colors are just so dang pretty. Before we glue them in, let's modify the eyelids. To start working on the eyelids, we need to remove the old eyelashes. These ones were giving me a hard time, so I decided to soak them in hot water and Dawn dish soap. After that, they came right out. When these dolls are new, their eyelids don't like to open all the way, so we have to do something called boggling. This means we need to cut a little nick in the back of the eyelid, so that when we put the eyelids back in the doll, there's a little space for the eyelids to go over the hinge. This allows the lids to open fully. Blythes have 4 sets of eyes, 2 that point forward and 1 that points each direction. So that means we need 8 total eye chips. I place a little bit of tacky glue on the back and then stick them in the socket. The eyes are really what brings life to the doll, and these ones are so pretty. Now it's time to paint the eyelids. First, we need to sand off the gloss as acetone is too harsh on this plastic. Then buff it with a microfine sandpaper. While wearing my safety gear, I sprayed it with Mr. Super Clear. Then I started with a metallic gold base coat with my airbrush. After that was completely dry, I masked off diagonal lines with washi tape. Then airbrushed a burgundy red color. Then carefully removed the washi tape and touched up a few places. Then used some gloss varnish to set it. If you look carefully, you can see flecks of gold in the red too. Then I cut some human false eyelashes and glued them in. Why did I paint the eyelids? Well, it's customary in the Blythe collector's circle to have little pieces of artwork on the eyelids. That is some Gryffindor pride right there. Now let's paint her some ears. I couldn't find any doll ears that were already black, so I decided to paint these ones. I started by spraying them with Mr. Super Clear to give the paint something to grip onto. Then I sprayed them with my paint mixture. I wanted to try out shading them with my airbrush, so I watered down a dark brown paint and got to painting. Because these dolls open on the side, I don't want to glue the ears on, so I'm going to use museum putty. These ears are designed to go over the doll's original ears. They look a little silly with no hair on, but they add a special quality to the face with hair. Now let's give her some backplate bling. Since the outer shape of the Gryffindor crest is symmetrical, I started with a box and divided it in half. Then slowly began to add details. Then I pulled out my acrylic paints and got to laying down flats. Please forgive me, I'm not a painter. Then started adding in some details. For the gold, I pulled out my Arteza paint. Then did some outlining with my watercolor pencils. In the customizer's world, the backplate is a great little place to have a little extra art and the artist's signature. Then added some gloss over the top. And finished it up with Mr. Super Clear. Now she's got her Gryffindor crest. Now for the part I've really been dreading. I won't lie to you folks, I've been really scared to get started on her hair. I've never thinned curly hair before, but I started by preparing my biodegradable straws. I cut each straw into thirds. Then with half the straws, I cut a line down the center. With the hair down the part and around the center face, I just put them in curlers. I didn't want to do any cutting on those. I wrapped the hair around the straw that doesn't have a slit in it. Placed the slit piece on top and secured it with bobby pins. Then for the rest of the hair, I would grab sections and twist it. Then used my thinning shears on the twisted part and brushed it out, and put it in a curler. Then put boiling water into a bowl and let it sit for 10 minutes. Then took it out and put it in front of a fan for 24 hours. After sitting 24 hours in front of a fan, I decided it was time to pull out the curlers. And it looked pretty good. So then I took out the rest of them. Just look at those ringlets. But I wanted the hair to look a little more natural, so I pulled them apart. I tried my best to be gentle with them so they wouldn't get all frizzy. And I think the hair looks healthier now and more natural. But I still wanted to lay a little bit flatter, so I'm putting a rubber band around her head and letting it sit overnight. I also sprayed a little water. Hopefully this helps. Now it's time to put all the pieces together. I started by putting the eye mechanism together, then getting out my Gryffindor cording. There are two places you need to pull cording through, one on top and one on bottom. Then you tie some large knots and hit it with fire so it doesn't unravel. Then put the eye mechanism into the faceplate. Next, attach the scalp to the faceplate. Next, we need to cut down the T-bar and install it into the eye mechanism. The T-bar is what makes the eye mechanism work. Next, thread the cord through these two holes. Then place the body in the neck joint and close up the face. Then secure it all with the 3 screws in the back plate. Now let's bling up those pull rings. So first we need to turn her over. I chose these beads because they were Gryffindor colors, but the black ones I chose because they look kind of mystical looking. I start by tying a knot in the cording, then thread the beads through. Then double knot it at the end of the beads. Folks, look at how cute these charms are. I wrap the cord around the jump ring of the charm several times. Then tie a double knot and hit it with fire so it doesn't unravel. And repeat all of this for the other cord. Then we have some beautiful pull rings to control her eyes. Then we stick on the ears. Now I think she needs her wand. I decided polymer clay was the best option for this project. But this particular clay was giving me a hard time, so I decided to put some clay softener in it. That helped a lot, so I was able to get started. I first began by rolling out the clay with my fingers and narrowing it at one end, then cutting it to length and reshaping it. Then I put it in the oven at 260 degrees for 5 minutes. This gave me a strong base to work with. Then I rolled out really tiny strips of it and wrapped it around the wand. I wish I could have gotten all the little details on the wand, but this was already impossible to work with. When I finished, I put on a base and popped it back in the oven. I think it looks really cute, but hopefully Hermione likes it. She's gonna need her luggage. Before we get started on that, I wanted to show you guys the crook shakes I ordered. Isn't it cute? Okay, so we're gonna start with the steamer trunk. First, we need to cut a piece of wood the right size, then use a router on the edges to give it that rounded shape. We cut and rounded the suitcases too. On the trunk piece, we only rounded the top 2 edges. This particular type of wood has lots of grooves in it, so I used this spackle stuff to see if I could smooth it out. After it was dry, I sanded it down. Once it was smooth, I went ahead and made marks where the trunk opening is going to be. I did this on all 4 sides. Then I began carving a groove over that line. Once I was happy with the look of it, I started painting. I want it to look like leather, so I went with the grain and then I did a second coat against the grain so it would be layered. I wanted to add some distressing to the trunk, so I watered down some black and brown paint, then painted that along the edges and wiped it up with a paper towel. Then I added some paint where I was going to add some leather bands. I took my faux leather and cut it into very narrow strips and tested it on my trunk to see how it fit. Then glued it in place with tacky glue. After that had set, I added some more of the watered down paint along the edges. This also helped the leather blend in. Then I took some shorter strips and put glue on the ends and placed it on the sides for handles, and used a black pen to make rivets. I needed to get the Hogwarts logo on top of the trunk, so I tried some of this printable temporary tattoo paper. I painted a lighter base so it'd pop more. Then I placed it and wetted the back, and it worked. Next, I needed to make some hardware, so I pulled out my Fimo and got to work. For the hinges, I simply put a small cylinder piece on top, and holes to look like bolts. The trunk lock was far more complicated. I also made my suitcases locks while I was at it. When I was done sculpting, I put it in the oven for 5 minutes at 260 degrees. Then I painted everything with this brass gilding paint. But that looked far too nice for this beat-up trunk, so I needed to age it a bit. So I watered down some brown paint and aged them up a bit. Then I glued on the hardware and painted her initials on the side. It's looking pretty snazzy. Now for her suitcases. This time I had the blocks rounded on both sides. And I still don't have wood filler, so I used the spackle instead. Then I marked and carved my opening line. I painted one suitcase brown and the other one green. Then cut my leather strips and glued them to the outside of the suitcase. Then watered down some paint to add some distressing. I stenciled on some lighter paint for my tattoo. Then placed my temporary tattoo that I printed. Then wet it so the back would just slide off. Added my polymer clay hardware that I made, and added these jewelry D-rings as handles. I love the way they look. Now, Hermione wouldn't leave home without her time turner, so let's make her one. So I started by rolling out some polymer clay. Then I rolled this wire around a dowel and placed it into the clay. Next, I needed to make the hourglass, so I cut the heads off of some nails. Then placed those nail heads into the clay too. As you can see, everything was so tiny I had to use tweezers. Then I baked it in the oven. After that cooled, I put everything in the gilded paint so it all matched. Then carefully glued the centerpiece and all the rings together. Then glued in and painted the nail heads. I also wanted to make her a spew badge. So I printed out a design and glued one of my glass eye chips on top. Once that fully dried, I carefully cut it out. Then I decided to use a stud earring for the pin back. Everything is so tiny. How is this girl supposed to get all of her luggage and things onto the train? She obviously needs a luggage cart. I first needed to make a base. So I pulled out a piece of wood and traced the trunk on it. Then angled in one end and cut the pieces. Then took a wooden dowel and cut rounds to make tires. I rounded the edges so it looked more like tires. Then found the center point and drilled a hole. Then I measured and cut a smaller dowel to make an axle. Then began to glue the pieces together with my gluing jig. And measured and cut a dowel to make the handle. Glued on some arms and attached the handle. I decided to make a basket for the front, so I made it out of popsicle sticks. I cut the sticks to size and glued them together. Next, I painted the handle and tires black. Then glued the basket brace and the basket to the front of the cart. Put my tires together and painted a rim on the outside of the tire. Then painted everything a base coat of gray. Then used my metallic paints to make it look like metal. You know I had to dirty it up with watered down brown, it's kind of my thing. I then added a satin gloss to the tires and the handle. Next, I had to make the pieces for the front wheel well, and put it together. Yes, the wheels move. Not well, but they move. Lastly, I attached the back axle with these wire U's that we've made. I have to let it sit upside down overnight, so you guys get the idea. I needed to figure out a way to keep this untamable hair out of her face. I decided she needed a headband, so I made a wire frame and filled it in with hot glue. Then I wrapped it in ribbon. Next, I felt like she needed a book. So I cut a piece of wood to size, traced the shape on a piece of tagboard, cut it out and lightly scored the folds so it would bend easily. Then I put small pieces of wire on the spine. I have this fabric that looks like faux leather. So I cut a small piece and glued it to the tagboard. Then glued the piece of wood inside. Lastly, I felt like she needed scrolls. So I grabbed some parchment paper and cut it to size. Then crumpled the paper and rolled it on a small dowel. Then stuck it into some tea to stain it. In order to make the finials for the scrolls, I got out my polymer clay. While those were in the oven, I painted the edges of the book. Then painted the cool pieces of clay and glued them onto the scrolls. I am so pleased with how it looks all together. There are so many little details that you'd probably never see unless you saw them in person. And here we go, the big reveal. Here's another doll to show you what she looked like before, and here she is after. Making this doll had a lot of firsts for me. I've never worked with a dark pigmented doll before. I've never sculpted eyelids, never worked with curly hair, and have never made any of these props before. I'm in love with so many aspects of this doll. I hope you guys enjoyed watching.